Hello, and welcome to the latest INSSA Insights episode. In today's episode, we're going to do something that we've been talking about doing for a little while among the INSSA leadership, and that's to do a year in review of 2022, as well as a year ahead to see what's going to be happening for NGO Security Managers in 2023. I'm joined today by Ben Longworth, who's Director of Security with On Call International, and Joe Gleason, who's Director of Global Risk Management with AHT Insurance. Ben, Joe, welcome to INSSA Insights. We're thrilled to have you both.
Thank you for having me.
And so I guess I'm going to jump right in here. This has been a very tumultuous, to say the least, last couple of years. I think we could probably say that every year we say that, but I think this year is in particular. And so I'm just going to start off with asking you guys, what are your top five things that were sort of the most influential, impactful when it came to NGO security management, or that NGO security managers really had to pay attention to? What are your thoughts? Ben, I'll start with you.
Okay, thanks. First of all, I just wanted to state that these thoughts are my own, and while I work for On Call International, those thoughts are personally my thoughts and aren't attributed to my organization, just as a disclaimer right off the bat. But certainly a tumultuous year, as we're all aware. The big one that we're all thinking about, of course, is the Ukraine crisis, which I'm sure we're going to talk about deeper on this episode, and the impact that had both at the time of sort of about a year ago now, right? But also throughout the year of groups that weren't necessarily just in Ukraine, but ones that are either working on the periphery or actually working in Ukraine as part of the relief effort and supporting that.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think one thing to think about there is also the sort of the collateral damage, for lack of a better word, of the Ukraine crisis in the aid sector, where we saw massive concerns about famine and things like that, because food supplies and things that normally came out of Ukraine, wheat and just weren't making it. And so that sort of magnified things that were already, NGOs were already facing in the field. Joe, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Ukraine is right up there, right? I think both to the immediate issues in Ukraine, the surrounding countries as well, some of the destabilization thankfully hasn't progressed. And then I think, Amaury, as you know, the wider. I think geographically, a couple places hop out to me. I would say, while it started in 2020, I think Afghanistan still, there are still ripples of Afghanistan, both for those operating in the country, and we saw towards the end of the year an effort to limit or have NGOs not employ female staff, and a whole bunch of issues had sort of come up through the year. I think we're going to continue to see those kinds of challenges for NGOs, as well as challenges in the country for NGOs implementing programs and for Afghans living there. But also, I think last year, remarkably, a number of our clients certainly were still in the final throes of assisting at-risk Afghans who had evacuated to third countries. So sort of a long tail on that. Hoping that doesn't stretch into 2023, but that certainly was an issue that continued and was present in 2022.
We're looking at that region there. Anything else in the South Asia region that pops to mind?
I would just throw out not so much a regional issue, although there are regional manifestations of this. We saw one just the other day in Turkey and Syria. It's natural disasters as a risk in 2022. The Pakistan floods come to mind in South Asia, but on the from where I sit, both with our NGO clients, but even more broadly, the impacts of climate change are being seen kind of wide and far, and some of them are these headline grabbing, whether it's the floods in Pakistan or a severe storm, or it's even just smaller scale flooding. We had a client, there were flash floods in Chad, where it really impacted an NGO's ability to support refugee population that they were working with. All resolvable ultimately, but nevertheless a risk and something that had to be managed, responded to, and then ultimately managed. And I think we're just going to see more and more of that.
Yeah, and talking into that a little bit more about the climate change and security issue. What can NGO security managers do? And this is for both of you guys. What can NGO security managers do to prepare themselves for that sort of intersection of climate change and security issues, both the broader ones that are sort of the really, sort of macro level things, but even to that granular, how do we, look at resources that then affect our staff? And obviously that's what's going to affect the NGO security managers the most. What are some of those things that they can be looking at to sort of prep themselves for ongoing climate change issues?
I would say treating just the overall theme of resilience that you would, as any organization would, operating domestically, but really bringing that resilience theme to your international programs, right? On the local emergency level of how do you certainly respond if you have a serious flood, things like that, wildfire, earthquake, anything kind of in those general areas. But then how do you, from a business continuity perspective, get those programs back up and running quickly and, as far as like the critical functions?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think wrapping that into your, risk register and then tying some specific mitigation measures and resources to make sure you're really addressing the potential risks. And it's going to be country by country, right? Some places it may be, maybe flooding, and other places it may be storms. But knowing in that country specific context, what is that climate related risk, and what can you do to mitigate and ultimately respond? I think prior to COVID, I think a lot of organizations had, pandemic in their broader risk registers, but we were reminded how much we really need to tie those mitigation measures to that risk. What might that risk look like? And I think that exercise is super important to really get granular and focus on it. And climate change is another good example of where we got to build that out.
Yeah. Moving back into the sort of the major topic, I think that was on people's minds was certainly Ukraine, and Ben, you mentioned that. I think that's probably one that's going to go into as one of the top 5 in 2023, I'm sure, of your list. But from your side, your perspective, what were some of the major issues that NGOs faced that you knew of, or that security managers writ large were facing with dealing with operations in Ukraine and surrounding areas?
So for those organizations that I think already had a footprint, what I thought was very interesting was, one, having to pivot whatever their mission is within the context of a full-blown war conflict if there weren't, far out east originally. So pivoting that, but I'd also say one of the things that I really came across was just the shift in as far as evacuations and things along those lines for the local national population, which, as Joe and I have discussed in the past, isn't always necessarily feasible. It has to do with, refugee issues and border restrictions. And certainly we saw the welcoming of Ukrainian refugees, into those countries on the western border, where we were able to facilitate ground evacuations. But of course, those were, for the most cases, just only elderly, females, children, things along those lines. So organizations that were operating in Ukraine, but had to send maybe their family members back over the border, that sort of separation is a really unique evacuation scenario.
Yeah. And I think it also expanded on our views of duty of care, where it's not to say that organizations didn't have duty of care to their local staff and employees, but a lot of that time, and you've said this before, a lot of times it stopped at the border. So like anything from a duty of care perspective that organizations were able to do within the confines of, the country, they would do. But this time, as you said, because it was so welcoming, that like getting people out made us shift and made NGO security managers and their broader, HR departments, et cetera, shift to a larger duty of care that they probably weren't used to. which came with its own level of risks and things like that.
Yeah, and it wasn't just getting them out of the country, right? It was sort of that onward, and where does that line end, duty of care wise? But what is their end destination for a country? Where are they going to live? How are they going to be set up? Which I'm sure you came across that, Joe.
Yeah, and I think this follows on, and we can't dismiss the recent precedent with Afghanistan, right? Where a number of organizations evacuated at-risk Afghans. And so I think that started to set into motion a pattern, maybe it's too strong of a word, but certainly an established precedent of supporting the evacuation of local national staff. Lots of differences between the two situations. Don't want to suggest they're too similar. But I think at the broad sort of global level, there are enough similarities that I think we've started to establish some sort of practice within the community. But I think, that was the kind of first phase of the response or the support to those in the Ukraine crisis. The next to me was, then how do you support remote programming? So now your teams were in the border countries, Poland largely, but also elsewhere, Romania, Slovakia to a certain degree. All right, now they wanted to do some remote programming. How do you support that? How do you, And then there was the sort of phase we're in now, which was resume on the ground programming in Ukraine, and we've watched a number of NGOs, initially in the pure humanitarian space, but increasingly in the broader development, democracy, rights, civil society space, resume operations in Ukraine in various capacities, a lot with sort of short-term travel of internationals and Ukrainians that are based in Poland, right? And then in-country Ukrainian teams. So we've watched a lot of our clients, look at all the basics, right? The risk assessments, the plans and procedures, the resources to support, whether that's assistance providers or insurance, all of which is particularly complex and challenging in the context of Ukraine, but for which there are solutions that are out there. It just, it takes some work.
Yeah. Here's sort of a question. Do you guys think are we out of COVID? Is the pandemic over for us, in your opinion?
Do you want to take that one, Joe, or first? What you got?
Oh, I'd love to hear your answer. Yeah, look, I think we have passed the height of the pandemic. I think just given where we are in terms of vaccinations and kind of global kind of herd immunity at this stage, everything should be caveated by at this stage. But it's a risk we're going to have to continue to manage, right? I think not unlike natural disasters going into that risk register, COVID, and I think COVID specifically, but pandemic disease in general, needs to be in that risk register. And again, not giving it kind of lip service, but really tying risk management measures to it. One thing I remind all my clients, Ben, I'm sure you talk to people as well, is, if you travel now internationally, you get COVID, you're not getting back on that plane for your international flight back. You may not even be that sick. You may be a mild or moderate illness, but the second you test positive, suddenly that 3-day trip turns into, a much longer trip. More of an inconvenience than the risks we were mitigating early in the pandemic, but it remains a risk. And certainly medical infrastructure around the world is uneven, to say the least. So there are some places where even managing it medically remains a significant challenge. So it's there. It's one of many, but it hadn't gone away.
Yeah, I would say definitely in 2022, we saw a greater easing of border restrictions, travel restrictions. 2020 was basically lockdown. 2021, a little bit easier. 2022, more feasible to get into a lot of these countries. But I would say the COVID impact in 2022 is very interesting for NGOs, more on the program side. Certainly, of course, we're referencing the risk to employees and personnel, but as far as being able to pivot back, maybe if the mission of the organization had to adapt to the pandemic from either tangential support or actual health support, and now maybe pivoting back to whatever their prior mission or perhaps a new mission might be, and that can be counter malaria work, cholera work, guinea worm, things like that. And it's just interesting to see organizations might be able to kind of put that focus back on. And then, of course, I'm sure there is a change in focus in a lot of these markets based off what was the strain on the healthcare. What does the healthcare system look like now versus 2019?
Yeah. Shifting gears or regions, I should say. Looking at Africa, what areas or what were the sort of major security threats or risks that NGOs faced from your perspective in that region? And understanding that that's a very broad region and it's very convoluted and things like that, but broader Africa, let's put it that way.
Ben, you want to jump in here?
Okay, I know you want to talk about the Sahel, so I'll let you lead off on that.
Joe.
Yeah. Look, I think one area that I watch a lot of clients focus on is the Sahel, right? And I think particularly Mali, Burkina, to a lesser degree, Nigeria, Chad, maybe even. And I think it was a number of issues. One, it was the kind of core ongoing insurgencies in those countries that have,
and even an expansion.
Yes.
I think there's a pretty large expansion, especially out of Mali and things like that into Burkina.
Yes. Yeah, right. So that's grown. I think obviously the political instability, coups haven't helped with that and have added to insecurity. And I'll add another layer that kind of gets into a broader risk, and that is the impact of some geopolitics on NGOs' ability to operate, right? As we see in the Sahel in particular, Russian influence growing. I think we're seeing host countries looking at measures to restrict the operations of Western NGOs, and whether that's more restrictive laws or reporting requirements, visas, etc. It's becoming more challenging, and I think we're gonna see that as a trend. I mean, we already have. I think that trend is only going to increase, not just in the Sahel, but I think globally. This sort of closing of civil society space and the impact that has on NGOs. But I think it's been noticeable in the Sahel, along with these other issues that NGOs are facing there.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say a great example would be in Mali, where I believe it was November of last year, where they're not only is there pushback on French military support in a lot of these countries, but also on NGOs, anyone in the humanitarian space connected to France has French technical support, funding, things along those lines. And, the natural pushback, the push towards Russia and push back away from France. And with that in mind, I think in the same vein of what Joe's talking about, we could start to see that move more broadly from just French, related organizations to more US, UK, Canadian, broadly across Western-backed NGOs.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing it already, right? In Mali, in changes in reporting requirements for NGOs, and an increased interest in reporting financial data and where you're getting money, and all these levers that authoritarian governments increasingly use to restrict the operations of NGOs. All in the guise of good governance, right? But I think it's how you use that information. We're starting to see that in Mali in particular, and I think we're just seeing the beginning of that.
Yeah. What influences do you guys think the broader geopolitical issues that we're facing? We offline before we were mentioning China, things like that are happening. What are the broader implications of those geopolitical battles I'm thinking the growing tension between China and the United States. There's obvious tension between the U.S. and Western governments with the Russian government, and that is playing out. It seems now, mostly on the ground. Certainly, I've seen it from travels, on the ground in Africa and things like that. But do what are your views? Do you guys think that geopolitical tension is really going to push its way down to to that micro level for NGO implementation and things like that, or for assistance that's being implemented?
Well, I think on just the security situation overall, if you look at that in those two countries we were talking about, Mali, Burkina Faso, of the pivot towards Russia as sort of the military backer for a security guarantee, or certainly with the Wagner Group in those countries, and having them fill in that vacuum that as the French are being kind of forced out of those countries. And what is really the capability of the Wagner Group? Certainly a notorious group. There's a lot of connotations there as far as what their capability would realistically be from a security standpoint. And I'm not suggesting that they necessarily will play by the exact same rules that, like, say, the UN mission in Burkina Faso is, and things along those lines. But what does that look like, and how does the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine war, affect the Wagner Group in terms of funding, resources, things along those lines, and their ability to actually maintain it's not a stable security environment currently, but if they want to get to some sense of a stable security environment, if that's where a lot of the tension is driven.
Yeah, look, a lot of this pushback on NGOs is not new. We can look back to harassment and pressure that NGOs faced in places like Pakistan, or certainly I can recall in my not so distant past life in Egypt, where a number of NGOs were expelled. So there's already this natural, if you will, tension, particularly in emerging democracies or autocratic or authoritarian states. There's already this tension with the role of NGOs, right? I think the challenge is now with this rising geopolitical tensions, and sort of the Russian and Chinese influence, governments that, what often kept governments in check was the flow of Western aid and the support of Western governments. If they're looking more to the Chinese or Russians for that, well, suddenly they're not going to be restrained in the same way. And that, that may reflect in their adherence to human rights or around corruption issues, which, these are all big picture geopolitical issues, but how do they factor into NGOs? Well, it may be access, right? It may be ability to get registered. It may be the ability to get permits to conduct certain programs or to travel to certain areas. All of those things we've relied on from host country governments may suddenly shrink. And then if you add any additional hostility, having been the recipient of a number of offices that are closed, and in two very different ways, watching offices get raided, in some cases with armed police that look like something out of a TV show, and others in sort of guys with bad fitting suits that sort of show up and shut down an office. So it can look very different in different places, but it has the same impact, right? It shuts down a program, even if it's just temporarily. It may expel staff. And we shouldn't forget the pressure on host country staff can be enormous, right? The national security intelligence infrastructure pressuring you to give information on the NGO you're working for, all these kind of things just add to the already difficult challenges that that host country team members face implementing programs. So I think this, sadly, this isn't new. It isn't going away, and I think it's going to increasingly get worse as this geopolitical tension increases.
And one type of program I would single out is the organizations that do election monitoring, which I know has a lot of can be controversial, as you guys know, and some of these locations. I think just the access for those kinds of programs is going to be increasingly more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely, and that space is shrinking. I mean, democracy now is really seeming to really be fighting right now for a foothold, and it seems like it's kind of slipping in a lot of places that seemed for a while to be in an upward swing. Have really dropped a couple notches, and I think that and civil society and NGOs are often seen as the policy, you know, implementing of American or Western policy on their, on their values or their systems of governance, where even unrelated, just general civil society capacity building can be seen as very detrimental, because it's like they don't see that far of a jump from, oh, you're just organizing to make sure the trash is cleaned up here, to, oh, now you're organizing politically
Right.
against them.
No, and it's seen as threats, and unfortunately, NGOs are seen as low hanging fruit. Right, local NGOs first, but then international NGOs. And I will say, in the past year, I have done work with clients in Zimbabwe, and I'm starting a project with a client in the Caucasus about this specifically, to help them look at the risks associated with government pushback. And it certainly manifests in some direct security risks, right? Wrongful detention, again, closing down of offices, et cetera, expulsion of staff, maybe even holding people at airports, international travelers. So there's a lot of kind of what we would see as security risks in this. And so, yeah, I've been working increasingly with clients to look at this, see how to mitigate, what resources can be brought to bear to help manage this. Sadly, it's I'm getting more questions about this, not fewer.
Yeah. Heading north a little bit, north and east from Africa to the Middle East. Any things jump out at you there from your perspective, as far as things that for 2022 that were major flashpoints or points of interest that you guys saw in your fields?
I would say, and you could categorize it into a look back and a look ahead. I think we're going to see continued increased tension in Israel-Palestine areas, both from traditional attacks, just general conflict, protests, activity on both sides. It's really starting to heat up there. So that's certainly nothing new, but that's one that's very much on everybody's radar, where it seems to be ratcheting up right now.
Yeah, I'd agree. The other one I would just draw attention to is potential political instability in Lebanon. We've seen it kind of bubble up. It hasn't quite spilled over into big picture effect, but it's rumbling underneath the surface. And I say that in part because Lebanon has become such a focus for some organizations who are doing work in the region, given sort of its general infrastructure. But that could change. We've certainly seen it flare up in the past.
Across the Atlantic to Central and South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. I think I know who you're going to pick for 2022 for this one, but I think there's a few candidates actually, but one in particular sticks out. So I'll run it over to Ben. Where do you guys? What were flashpoints in the LAC region?
Well, certainly, I think Haiti is the easy one, and we can get into that. I think 2022, last summer, Ecuador, a lot of political disruption there. And then as we look right now into tail end of 2022 into 2023, continued problems in Peru, just from a government standpoint of really, if you look at the last 5 years of presidents trying to stay in power, and just any sort of functioning government in Peru leading to violence, leading to very disruptive protest activity. But Haiti is sort of the easy example on the dartboard of where it's just becoming less and less feasible to have a functioning program, specifically in that greater Port-au-Prince area. And I know that's such an important spot for a lot of NGOs and faith-based organizations, given proximity to the US, right? But it's just the gang crisis, the political crisis, economic crisis in Haiti is sort of an easy one to pick.
Yeah.
Do you see it spilling over? Or sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Oh. No, I was just going to riff on that just a little bit more. Clearly Haiti kind of stands out in the region. I just prior to this call, got off the phone with a client who's really sitting down and kind of looking at their options to continue. And we really talked about it in terms of what's some historical precedents, how have organizations confronted these deep changes in risk environment, and really going back, particularly as you talk to funders about continuing programs that may have been going on for 5 or 10 years in some cases. How do you go back and say, all right, now we've got to radically restructure, and they're looking at two options. One is a very Iraq, Afghanistan, Mogadishu style hardened compound, armored vehicle movements, armed close protection officers. Now, Haiti's very different than those other environments, maybe a little analogous to Mogadishu at certain points in terms of the anarchic elements, right? It isn't just, insurgents against a government. There's a whole lot more going on in Haiti. But I certainly think that's one model organizations are looking at, albeit reluctantly. And the other is, sort of offshore or limited offshore programming where you may run a management team from, I know one client who's doing it from the Dominican Republic with very periodic travel back into Port-au-Prince, which does then include a whole, series of journey management, close protection team. And then, a sort of skeleton Haitian national staff managing on the ground in between. Now, extraordinary risks for Haitian national staff. That doesn't get rid of the risk either. So no good answers there. And I know the community is struggling with it. And I think, particularly as we start to look into 2023, unless something radically changes, I think we're going to see we're going to see bigger changes in how organizations have to manage that risk. And that's going to mean more resources and ultimately more funding for security management.
Yeah, I absolutely concur. Fingers crossed. When you guys are looking at the last year and the things that we've discussed as sort of your top 5 or top your top choices of what were the sort of the flashpoints around, how did your clients, those that were both NGO and I think the NGO sector could learn a lot from the private sector, and vice versa, but so wherever your clients were, how were they dealing with those security issues that they faced? What resources were they tapping into? Joe or Ben?
Yeah. I think in some ways we had and I think many organizations took advantage of an opportunity coming out of the height of the pandemic to relook at their systems, right? Their security risk management plans, their procedures, how they were assessing risk. And I think a great number of our clients really went back and refreshed those systems, driven in part by need, right? I think the pandemic made many users more conscious of their risk, more travelers, end users, if you will, more conscious of their risk. And they came to their organizations and said, what are we doing about X or Y? People who prior to the pandemic were sort of those seasoned travelers who would hop on planes and go anywhere and do anything without asking any questions, suddenly we're asking questions. And so I think some of it was demand driven. Some of it, I think security management teams said, hey, we need to go back and refresh. So, and the one area, or I guess 2 areas where I think there was particular emphasis, one is around rolling in individual risk profiles into risk assessments. And I think, again, that was happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic really accelerated it because each of our personal health factors really influenced our ability to travel at various points. And so I think that then pushed more and more organizations to say, okay, well, if it's individual health, it's also, sexual identity. It's also gender-based issue. Let's pull in all those individual risk factors and make sure we're not just looking at country risks, organizational risks. I think the community's been good about those, right? But let's also bring in that individual we're sending. What are the risk factors that they face and how do we need to manage? So I think those were there. And I think training. I think I've had so many more requests for, I shouldn't say training, education more broadly, right? Everything from traditional heat or HEFAT training to micro learning to how do we prepare people to better engage with our third-party assistance provider. So I think that risk assessment piece and the learning have been two big areas that clients have really used to address, and ultimately it's helped address and manage the ever-evolving risk environments we find ourselves in.
Very similar thoughts on the risk profile concept. I think from my perspective, I see more organizations and more travelers be forthcoming about those issues of gender, sexuality, and certainly the health information as we keep going into even things on health. Travelers tend to be a bit more forthcoming with what medications they're on. And there's a lot of rules about, can you bring this particular medication into a specific country or a country you're transiting through? And there's a lot of nuance there of what makes up those medication and like the different lists and standards per country. So that's something I've seen that I think has been a positive. Agree with the training, definitely on like HEFAT and heat training. Those stand out to me. Where I would say in addition is, I think a lot of organizations looked at that kind of training for maybe a subsect of their population that was going into those very intense locations, Afghanistan being like an easy example, right? Whereas I think what I'm seeing is their organizations are seeing value to spread that out across their population. And in some respects, that might make their overall population more prepared, right? And then also maybe more flexible of, okay, we have people in Ukraine, who else can join a program like that and kind of meeting that standards. And similarly, when we talked about the local national aspect earlier, and certainly one of the things I encourage is bringing that training or a variation of that training down to the local level. Because at the end of the day, those are the people who are really operating in those markets. We're talking about Haiti, we're talking about kidnapping risk, we're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about landmines, things like that.
Yeah. Ben, that's a really good point. And I think one thing that I've noticed more and more clients focusing on is that, risk is managed at the farthest point, right? So it's not being managed from, where Amaury sits at headquarters, right? It's being managed by that person who gets in a vehicle in rural Uganda and drives from point A to point B, and making sure that all those systems you've put in place flow down and that they understand, how do I do a pre-trip risk assessment? How do I access emergency medical care if I need it? So I think, and again, this was present before the pandemic, but I think a lot of this was really accelerated and jump-started, if you will, through the pandemic. There's been greater effort to say, Ben, I think to your point, let's make sure we're getting that information down to those people who are out there exposing themselves to the risk, right? Just that the country director gets this isn't sufficient. It really needs to be to that full team and that host country team in particular.
Yeah. Following up on that, and before I want to get your views on the forward-looking views, what are some of the top lessons learned from the last year? I mean, again, you guys talked into what are the resources and some of the changes that they're doing, but what are the lessons learned from the last year's events that you think should be handed down to security managers and stuff like that?
I would say some of the ones that stand out to me, back to that point of flexibility, of having your plans your response plans, whether it be more local level or wider crisis plans, not having them be so narrowed down that they can be ineffective. Because as we know, like take for instance a pandemic, right? That can take many different types of forms. There's general themes there, but being able to pivot those to the situation. And then another great lesson, and it kind of goes back into the last point we were talking about of the local population, is trying to use them as such a great local intelligence source. Even if they're not in a security role, they have valuable information and they have access to that local community. Can provide really good information just about protest activity, roadblocks? What are we seeing from general sentiment in these areas? And security managers being able to tap into those resources, and they may think of it as kind of a one-way street, and they're setting the tone, security down. It can go two ways of getting that great information.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one big lesson, kind of obvious, but is that risk is cross-operational, right? It cuts across teams at an organization. And so I'm seeing more and more of a trend of, rather than one department owns, if you will, the risk register or the risk management systems, that they may coordinate, but it's shared more across the organization in terms of how is risk impacting the organization, what measures do we have in place to manage them, what resources are we bringing to bear. It makes for often a more convoluted process, but ultimately the end result tends to be a stronger sense of shared risk management. Little bit of herding cats, but I think it tends to be worth it. And one area in particular I've seen this with a number of clients is with, call them slightly different things, but maybe a risk management or security management committee or working group that isn't just headquarters people. It also includes team members from around the globe to help really influence the structure of risk management systems. Is the format of our plan that we use in every country helpful? What kind of training do teams really need? And I think that sort of, it in the truest sense, has diversified and drawn in more thought that, again, takes more work to do, but I think ultimately results in stronger organizational risk management.
Yeah. Okay, time to take out your crystal balls. We're going to look and see what the future holds for NGO security managers in the coming for 2023. We're already almost 2 months in, at least a month and a half in, I guess, to 2023. So, what are your predictions that for the future of our field? What should we be looking at as we enter this year? Ben, go ahead.
Okay, I'll run down a quick list, and I think there's a lot of carryover from what we already talked about. From a hotspot perspective, Haiti is still going to be on there. Ukraine, and what does Ukraine look like? I think Ukraine has kind of taken different forms as the months kind of ebb and flow for what many expect to be offensives and counter offensives, certainly here in the spring. Turkey and Syria, obviously, based off what we've seen just in the past week, the devastating earthquake there is going to be kind of a natural focus for relief efforts. I mentioned Peru and sort of political instability, but I think that's more broad for just political instability in a lot of areas across the globe. We've certainly seen a lot of military coup style events in the last several years, and I would expect that to continue. And in a non-hotspot perspective, I would say one thing to keep in mind is changing a little bit in local laws and misinformation, disinformation, things along those lines. Just taking that example of Peru, like we were just talking about, of different laws in place and equating what is terrorism, right, into what are people posting on social media, and different laws like that we're seeing throughout the globe that can have real repercussions on organizations that aren't, conducting violence or anything like that can be interpreted from a legal and potential detainment standpoint.
Yeah, kind of following on that, I think that broader theme we talked about on, closing of space for NGOs and civil society, I think kind of plays into Ben's last point, and actually into the point about sort of disruptive political transitions. Some of these all sort of mesh together, but I think the closing of space for NGOs is going to grow. As we talked about the kind of geopolitical great power, if you will, sort of rivalries that are out there, as well as the disruptive political transitions and rise of some authoritarian and semi-authoritarian governments. creating laws that are going to be more onerous. You throw into the mix disinformation and misinformation, and you've got a real kind of cauldron of potential instability that NGOs can get caught up in, whether it's that demonstration and kind of kinetic activity there, or a legal infrastructure that may make the work you do suddenly really ambiguous, and a public announcement you make you may find yourself on the wrong side of government laws on communicating about kind of fill in the blank, right? Or you may be sued by another entity in a country for the actions you've taken. So I think we're going to see more and more of that as this space closes. And managers, security managers in particular, I think can't separate themselves from that, right? In some cases, this is a legal issue. In some cases, it may emerge as a banking or financial issue, but there are operational risk factors involved. And I think it doesn't do anybody any good, going back to that cross-operationalization of risk, to look at that pushback in silos, right? It's not just a legal issue. It's not just a financial issue or an HR issue. It's an organizational risk issue. So I think that to me is going to be a big trend to continue. I think natural disasters, I think we can't escape the ongoing realities of that. Obviously, we haven't in 2023, the tragedy that's unfolding right now in Turkey and Syria. And I think we're going to see more impact, big and small, of climate change, natural disasters as we kind of go forward. Regionally, I think, we've touched on Ukraine, Haiti. Obviously, I think the Sahel will continue to unfortunately deteriorate, both from an insurgency perspective, but also a closing space perspective.
When you guys are doing your analysis and advising your clients, and what are some of the resources that you find most useful, in your day-to-day searches that would be helpful for NGO security managers to tap into? Ben?
So I think from a research standpoint, that's, from my group, it's more of a combination of historical knowledge, both, country specific, but regionally, tapping into, of course, government sources. I think they're helpful, but better if they're kind of aggregated together to look for common themes between what different governments are putting out. I'm a big advocate of a lot of the great networking groups that we have here. Certainly OSAC, I think, is excellent. I would specifically single out those regional councils and those email distribution lists where people can submit questions. I think that's really helpful. And the country councils. I would say the analyst roundtable is an excellent group that has both, a regional chapters that I'm a big fan of. And then if I'm looking for information more tactically, it's great. And certainly from an NGO security manager standpoint, going back to tapping into that local network, I think that can be really helpful. And a great example would be in Haiti with all these faith-based organizations, because that's such a hub. They often have these large WhatsApp groups that, I have certainly seen, and they share great information related to, there's a roadblock here, we're expecting protests in this part of the city today. What are you seeing? Crime? Oh, there was just a kidnapping over here. So I think that information sharing and then building that within your peer group, certainly with organizations that operate in a similar area.
Yeah, look, I mean, nothing beats those information sharing networks, whether at the country level or the global, OSAC, different working groups that are there. I would add one other resource that I feel like often gets overlooked. I think that security and medical assistance providers are often seen as a great source of information, kind of at the big picture level. But the crisis response provider or special risks response provider that comes as a part of that insurance we're not all supposed to talk about, but we all know is essential: kidnap, ransom, extortion insurance. That's a really valuable resource. We often think of them as a purely reactionary resource. If you get somebody detained, you get somebody kidnapped, you call them, they help you manage. And that is correct. That is their principal role. But increasingly, I'm finding, and this has been particularly true in Haiti and Ukraine, actually, that though the crisis response providers are incredible proactive resources to talk about what does that risk environment look like? What are the actual, and this is particularly true in Haiti, what does that kidnap environment look like right now, almost in real time? And what are the mitigation best practices? Because the ones from last month, or certainly 3 months ago, probably aren't effective anymore. So I think that resource as a proactive resource is invaluable. And, just like, as I'm sure Ben would say for the folks at On-Call, calling in and talking to an analyst or somebody is crucial. The crisis response providers would say the same thing. They are always, in my experience, more than happy. And we coordinate calls all the time with, the likes of Control Risks, Crisis 24, not to drop too many names, but I think they're the big players in this space, to talk about those risk environments and mitigation measures. And I would just really encourage organizations to tap into that. It's a resource you have available. And
I would piggyback on that to say, especially when it comes to the crisis management or crisis response organizations, that you're tapped into, it's get to know them now, because the crisis is not the time to start saying, hi, my name is Amaury Cooper and I'm with this organization. You've never seen our plans. You've never seen our procedures. We've never chatted or talked before. But now we're going to be best friends because we're going to be together for the next whatever period of time that lasts. And it's going to be really intense. So I would say get to know them now. And I would go for the same thing for the likes of On-Call or ISOS or other organizations like that. Call them up and hear what they say when you call up and say, hi, I'm trapped in whatever, or I've got a medical issue, so that you know what that sounds like and the procedures that they're doing, before it happens. And so when someone asks you a question, that you know how to answer it. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
No, I said I absolutely agree. From the assistance provider standpoint, that's what we prefer, is to build those relationships ahead of time. I completely agree on the crisis, specialty crimes, those kind of crisis response providers as well. In some cases are the same entity. In some cases, they may not be. I think a lot of organizations forget that there's some good resources through that crisis response provider relationship as well, in terms of intelligence and things along those lines. It's a little bit of forgotten in sort of their provider list, because hopefully those cases are fewer and far between, hopefully.
Yeah. All right, we're coming close to the end of the hour. So I just have one last question for you both. And that is a question I think I ask all of our guests, and that is, what is on your nightstand from a reading perspective? Or what are you reading right now? So I'll throw it to Joe first.
Wow. Yeah, I think Ben and I have.
Obviously, it's great from a security manager perspective. Like, what are some books to read? But I mean, if you're reading a romance novel or something like that, that's fine too.
Yeah, no romance novels here, but sort of in the true topic, and the Kidnap Inside the Ransom Business by Anya Shortland is something I'm working through now. It's a good kind of business focused analysis of the world of kidnap for ransom. It's a fascinating sort of dive into it from a perspective we often don't get. But I want to plug two other books by the same author, Ty Gagney, who wrote two books ostensibly about search and rescue in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, not far from, I think, where Ben is right now. But really the subtext of both of them is about risk management, decision-making, and kind of going back to our earlier point, how people who go out and do things make decisions that ultimately influence their exposure to risk. And so I think if you kind of read it from that perspective, they're interesting books. One is called Where You'll Find Me, about a particular climber who was lost. And the other is called The Last Traverse, about two climbers, one who survived and one who didn't. And the sort of the efforts, both their thought process, decision-making, as well as then the search. So again, a little off topic, but I think still draws in the risk management perspective. And good reads too.
Yeah, I had the same book as far as a book that's on my bookshelf. I need to read that Anja Shortland book on the kidnap business. Mostly because she spoke at an OSAC event in London this past fall. She was the guest speaker, and so it's on my short list to read. Another one I'd recommend is Crisis Ready by Melissa Agnes, and that is more private sector driven, but I think there's a lot of good lessons learned and just about crisis management in general, where it's constructing crisis management plans. She dives a lot into reputational aspects of crisis management, which is certainly applicable to NGOs in terms of managing that message, donors, funding, PR kind of issues as well. So I think that's a great one to read if anyone is in the process of trying to build out a crisis management plan. I'd also plug a similar crisis management book by Regina Phelps. I believe it's her name.
Great. Well, Ben Longworth of On Call International, Joe Gleason of AHT Insurance, thank you both for being guests on INSSA Insights, and we hope to have you guys back on the show again. Thank you to the Robert McPherson Fellowship for its generous support and donation, helping to make these podcasts possible.